My name is Susie with the Flows Today program here, and I'd like to welcome everyone this Tuesday evening. Thank you for sharing your time with us. We hope to give you a great and informative presentation today on the Sustainable Streets Master Plan. Your presenters today will be Matt Fabry and Reed Bogert of the CCAG program, managing the Stormwater program. And we're going to go ahead and get started. Now, I would like to hand off this presentation to Matt Fabry. Matt, take it away.
It's great to have you here, and hopefully this will be informative and give you good information about what we're doing. So I'm going to say a couple things just to get started. First, I want to apologize if you hear music in the background. My kids both have music lessons tonight, so you may be hearing a little bit of piano now, and then in a little while you may hear some violin, so I apologize for that. It was not good planning on my part. Second, for those of you that haven't heard of CCAG or the Flows to Bay program, I'll just say a little bit about that. So CCAG is short for the City County Association of Governments of San Mateo County, and we are a joint powers agency with all the 20 cities and towns plus the County of San Mateo as our member agencies. And so we do things at a countywide scale that makes sense to be done at that level on behalf of all of those agencies. And CCAG's primary role is the congestion management agency for the county. And so a lot of what CCAG does is transportation related work. But my colleague Reed Bogert and myself are the two folks at CCAG that work on the, excuse me, the countywide stormwater program. And we call that the Flows to Bay program for short. And that program exists to help all of our member agencies comply with state regulatory requirements to keep pollution out of stormwater runoff and from going into our creeks, into the bay, into the ocean. And so Reed and I work on a variety of stormwater related topics. And what you're going to see tonight is an example of CCAG working on sort of something that crosses both of our primary roles in terms of transportation and stormwater for the agency. And we're going to talk about how we integrate transportation investments and planning with stormwater efforts. So with that, I'm going to jump in to talking about the plan, and just a couple of things before I get into this slide here in terms of what are sustainable streets. Just wanted to say as background, this plan is being funded by a climate adaptation planning grant by Caltrans, and we're very appreciative of Caltrans providing us the funding for this. This was a significant planning effort. It was a little over $1 million of planning work. So we did a lot with this effort, and we're going to show you sort of a high level of everything that we did. But if you want to get into any of the details, we'll show you at the end how you can access all of the information of all the things that we did. And I do want to say up front sort of what the plan is and what the plan isn't before we dive into it, because we did get some folks that were registering for the webinar asking, some questions about, why isn't this street designated as a certain type of, bike facility, or, what's going on with doing sort of transportation planning. And so this plan that we're going to talk about is really focused on what are the planned transportation investments that make sense for incorporating green infrastructure, and we'll get into what all that means. But so this planning effort was not focused on sort of finding new transportation investments. It was really focused on what are the existing planned investments that all of our member agencies have identified, and where of those, which ones make sense for incorporating green infrastructure. And so that gets me to this slide in terms of what do we mean by sustainable streets. And what we're really talking about is the opportunity to integrate sort of the transportation, mobility, and safety efforts that jurisdictions are undertaking. That's often referred to as complete streets, or active transportation, or bicycle and pedestrian improvements, or there's the Vision Zero movement that are jurisdictions are attempting to eliminate any injuries and fatalities from vehicles and pedestrians and cyclists. So we're trying to integrate those projects with green streets, where we incorporate what we call green infrastructure, which is specialized, landscape systems that will help to capture and clean stormwater runoff and catch that water closer to where it falls and get it into the ground, as opposed to having it run directly into our storm drain system and carrying all the pollutants that get washed off our urban landscape directly into the storm drains and then directly into our creeks in the bay and the ocean without any form of treatment. So we're trying to create infrastructure that helps provide safety and protects our community in terms of mobility, but also protects our communities and the environment in terms of pollution issues. So this sort of gives a example. You know, the picture in the center there is showing an example of what we'll talk about, you know, in more detail, is a stormwater curb extension where you've got a specialized landscape area in the roadway where the runoff from the roadway flows through cuts in the curb into this landscaped area. And then that water is filtered through the plants and soaks into the ground, is filtered by the soil, and then either infiltrates into the native soils, or if the soils aren't really good for infiltrating fast enough, then there sometimes is an under drain pipe that will take that clean water and send it back into the storm drain system. So when we talk about the evolution from sort of existing to complete to sustainable streets, we've got this series of images here that show this is an example of sort of an existing condition. You could imagine this on many parts of El Camino Real in San Mateo County, where you've got sort of low density development. It's very auto centric. You've got wide travel lanes that you know, lead to fast driving speeds. You've got limited bicycle and pedestrian amenities, makes it very intimidating and difficult for people to cross the street and to ride bikes on the street. You've got a lot of driveway cuts that break up the roadway or the sidewalk area. And so this is an example of how that development takes place and sort of shifts things towards complete streets, where you start to have more dense development that's providing, you know, more commercial and housing space. You end up with setbacks for the development. So you've got wider sidewalks, you get street trees, you get, you know, pedestrian scale lighting, you get better transit stops, you get better crosswalks, you get median refuge islands for people crossing the street, you get bike lanes. And then we take that one step further and we start adding in the green infrastructure, where we've put in what we call rain gardens or bioretention areas as part of the curb extensions and bulb outs that intercept the runoff in the gutter. We put in larger canopy trees that help provide shading. It also helps to intercept precipitation and retain rainfall before it actually gets to the ground. And we put in permeable pavement that acts like natural systems, where the water can actually soak through the asphalt or the concrete and get into the ground, so that we're reducing the amount of impervious area and the amount of runoff, as well as we're capturing runoff and cleaning it and slowing down the flow and getting that water back into the ground instead of sending it directly to the storm drain system. So we had a few key drivers of why we wanted to do this project. And the two main ones from a stormwater standpoint were, we have these regulatory mandates that are imposed on the municipalities in San Mateo County by the state through the Water Quality Control Board. And that's focused on improving water quality and reducing some of the pollutant impacts on you know, fish in the bay in terms of the ability to eat fish from the bay. And then we also have concerns about climate change and building resiliency. And as I mentioned, this is funded by a climate adaptation planning grant. So we really wanted to look at how is precipitation potentially going to change in future climate conditions, and how can sustainable streets help to adapt our streets so that we are hopefully mitigating any future increases in precipitation amounts, and in an effort to keep our streets from flooding and keeping our facilities functioning. So some of the things that we were trying to address through this was we wanted to prioritize what the opportunities were for doing these types of projects throughout the county. We wanted to understand how climate change may impact rainfall and stormwater runoff within the county. We really wanted to focus on how do we get integrated multi-benefit investments, so that if we're tearing up the roadways and tearing up curb and gutter, that we can get multiple benefits out of that and do it all at one time, as opposed to, you know, retrofitting our urban environment multiple times for different purposes. And then we really wanted to provide as much as we could in terms of tools for our member agencies to advance planning, design, and implementation of sustainable streets. So when we talk about climate change, I'm going to show a series of maps here that kind of give the sort of the key end results of the modeling that we did. But we worked with existing models that have come out of global climate analyses and that are provided through the state's climate adaptation clearinghouse, and we took those models and applied them to San Mateo County and applied them to our historical precipitation records to come up with how precipitation amounts will change and how runoff amounts will change. And the difference there is that when it rains, not all of that water runs off. A lot of it is soaks into the ground in people's yards or in parks or pervious areas, or is retained on tree canopy and things like I talked about. So we looked at, how does rainfall change, but then how does the actual amount of runoff change? And so these maps that I'm going to show you show how runoff depth increases. So this is sort of a way of saying how much runoff increases. And, this is a map of the county, and most, the interesting thing about San Mateo County is we're kind of divided in half, where half of the county within the green outlined area drains to the bay, and then the other half of the county drains to the ocean on the coast side. And so all of those little areas that you see there are sort of the sub watersheds where water drains into different creek channels and then eventually gets either to the bay or to the ocean. So we looked at these different storm recurrence frequencies, and these are storms that are predicted to occur with a certain likelihood of occurring in any given year. And so a 2-year storm is a more frequently occurring storm that has a 50% chance of occurring in any year. And so what you see in this map is the darker bluish areas show areas where our models are predicting that you will have an increase in the amount of runoff. And now I'm going to scroll through these slides that show these different storm recurrence frequencies so you can see how things change with larger storms. So we move to a 5-year storm, you start to see more areas that are colored in dark that have greater runoff amounts. 10-year storm, you see even more, and you definitely see a distinction sort of between the coast side versus the bay side, and that's based on sort of the natural topography and conditions that lead to more precipitation falling on the coast side of the mountain range that divides the county versus the bay side. You get to a 25-year storm, you start to see pretty significant increases. 50-year storm, you start to see some areas where you're getting, an inch and a half to 2.5 inches of increased runoff depth, which is pretty significant. And then for a 100-year storm, this is a storm that has a 1% likelihood of occurring in any given year. You start to see that areas around Pacifica, Daly City, and up in Colma, South San Francisco, San Bruno, especially in the Colma Creek watershed, we've got some significant areas that are potentially going to see large increases in runoff volume. And this definitely could cause a lot of problems in terms of overwhelming our storm drain systems and causing flooding of our roadways and flooding of properties and whatnot. So the modeling we did gave us a good sense of what the future could look like based on the global climate models. And then we did analyze how can sustainable streets help with that. And I won't get into the nitty-gritty details. You can read all about it in our technical memo that details all the climate work that we did. But we did find that if we implemented sustainable streets at a significant level, that's based on trying to achieve some of these water quality mandates, that we would have benefits in terms of mitigating increases in runoff for the smaller storms, for the 2-year and the 5-year storm events. And those are the storms that are more frequent and have a much greater likelihood of occurrence. And so once you get into these larger storms, green infrastructure is less helpful in dealing with those large storms, but it definitely showed that we would have benefits if we did widespread sustainable streets implementation on those smaller storm events to help keep the roadways from flooding on a recurring basis. So I'll just show this quickly without getting into the details of all these numbers. Basically, the columns that you see here are those different storm recurrence frequencies that I talked about. You can see on the left side, we modeled the ocean side and the bay side separately, and then we did an average for overall countywide. And so The number that I highlighted there, 25%, shows that for a 10-year storm, our models were predicting a 25% increase in the amount of runoff depth for a 10-year storm. And the reason we call out a 10-year storm is that's typically what storm drain systems are designed to handle in San Mateo County. And so this is sort of the storm events where if you go beyond that, you start to have problems with the storm drain system being able to handle that volume, and you start to end up having things back up onto the streets and flooding. So you see a 25% increase, and this is looking out at 2100. So it's fairly far in the future, and it's a conservative climate estimate. So it's kind of a more on the worst case scenario side of things, but we wanted to look at a conservative approach. But then if you look at sort of what changes between historical and our future projections, which is, you know, the historical row versus the median RCP 8.5 is the climate future, you'll see that a historical volume that you would see with a 10-year storm is predicted to start showing up with a 5-year storm. So you see a doubling in the frequency of that amount of runoff. And you see the same thing where what we would call a 25-year size storm now is looking like it would show up with a 10-year likelihood of recurring. And it gets even worse when you get to a 100-year storm, where you start to see what we would have currently with a 100-year volume, which is, this is a, you know, it's a really significant storm event, is happening on a 25-year recurrence frequency. So it goes from a 1% likelihood of happening to a 4% likelihood of happening. And you can see that that volume is actually even greater as predicted. So, you know, whether these scenarios come to pass or not, time will tell. And it depends a lot on how we do in terms of controlling greenhouse gas emissions. But this at least gives us the starting point for future conversations about what are we going to do in terms of trying to manage stormwater runoff at the same time that we're trying to deal with things like sea level rise and wildfire and drought and other climate impacted issues. So just quickly, you know, we do have, as I mentioned, these water quality mandates that are resulting in advisories on eating fish from the bay, where there are certain fish that are recommended to not be eaten at all from the bay, and then some with reduced frequencies. And so these are a result of certain legacy pollutants that are sort of spread out everywhere throughout the county at low concentrations. And so we already have a mandate to do a significant amount of green infrastructure to try to deal with these pollutants. And so our hope was that we could simultaneously solve sort of our water quality issues and our climate issues, and at least looking at what we can do within the public rights of way. That's where the Sustainable Streets Master Plan fits in. And so what we're really focused on, what Reed's going to talk to you about in just a minute, is how do we look at existing planned transportation projects and looking at things like safe routes to school and safe routes to transit, as well as opportunities to integrate with significant pavement rehabilitation, where you've got streets that are just failing in terms of their pavement and have to be reconstructed. What are the opportunities within those categories to integrate green infrastructure and build sustainable streets? How does this link up with jurisdictional green infrastructure plans that they've had to develop to satisfy these water quality needs? We've developed some project concepts that we'll show you. We've developed some model policy language that jurisdictions can consider adopting. And we've provided linkages to where the likely relevant sources of state and federal funding are, and local funding for implementing these types of projects.
Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. So I'm going to get into some of the core parts of the Sustainable Streets Master Plan and sort of the core analysis of project opportunities. And this slide is showing the different types of sustainable streets that we identified and worked with in the Sustainable Streets Master Plan. And we needed a way to talk about sustainable streets projects, what they are, as Matt described, and then also help with the identification and prioritization process for linking green infrastructure with planned active transportation improvements. And so this gave us a good way to do that with these different categories of projects. I'll just run through these quickly. The first typology is bulb outs and curb extensions. And these are, and I should say that the types kind of increase with complexity and cost across these bubbles here. So the first is really kind of the lower cost intersection and mid-block crossing improvement type, where you have pedestrian and bicycle safety improvements at intersections that can be integrated with green infrastructure. So you're seeing a curb extension there. The second typology is a longer linear type project. So this is a connectivity improvement where you're looking at maybe multiple blocks or street segments that are being worked on to help improve gaps in pedestrian and cyclist routes, maybe safe routes to school projects, but definitely the longer linear projects. You have bike lanes being introduced, long linear green infrastructure planters, maybe buffered bike lanes, and things like pervious pavement, and other enhancements to create those linkages. And then the third typology is a streetscape redesign, where you actually have the roadway and the sidewalk being worked on together. And this could be, a real complete street project with green infrastructure added in. And so you would see trees being introduced along the roadway, bigger sidewalks, pedestrian scale lighting and furniture, and then the green infrastructure in the street, possibly including pervious paving in the parking lane and that sort of thing. We'll see some examples of that. And then the last typology is labeled frontage improvements. And this is a little bit different in that the idea was to link sustainable streets projects with new and redevelopment projects. And so the funding would actually be provided by a development project, and you would see improvements in the right-of-way adjacent to the project itself, mostly in the sidewalk area. You might see trees being planted, street trees or tree wells, and then green infrastructure incorporated into the curb line there. So just a few examples, local examples of these typologies. So this is Laurel Elementary School, and CCAG paid for this project a few years ago. And here you can see a mid-block crossing with improved crossing. You have new signage, a shortened distance between the two sidewalks there, the green infrastructure, curb extensions integrated with the bulb outs. Here's a typology 2 connectivity improvement, and this is, again, several blocks. This is Burlingame, Cortlandt Avenue in Burlingame, and you're seeing here multiple intersections with the integrated curb extensions and new crossings, and this stretches, I think, 5 or so, maybe more blocks, so it's quite large, with the painted bike lane. Here's an example of a typology 3 streetscape redesign. This is also Burlingame downtown in Burlingame Avenue. And here you can see the entire streetscape was totally redone. New roadway with the new sidewalk condition and complete transformation, new seating, street trees, pretty much the whole 9 yards here, curb extensions, and this extends several blocks as sort of a downtown redesign. And then typology 4, frontage improvements here at Bay Meadows, also in San Mateo. And so here you have the new development went in, and then with that, the project paid for and installed curb extensions or planters behind the curb to help manage runoff that was going to be associated with the project. Okay, and then to get into the opportunities analysis, I'm going to talk about each of these in a few minutes in the slides ahead, so I won't go into too much detail here, but just kind of at a high level for the process following these arrows, you can see that we came up with the Sustainable Streets typologies and then went through a process of finding planned investments that are already planned for in local planning documents. And so our team went through a whole slew of local documents, general planning documents, downtown specific plans or neighborhood plans, green infrastructure plans that the municipalities have been working on, the safe routes to school audits, transit hub planning documents, Caltrans actually, we looked at the Caltrans District 4 bike and ped plan. And so we tried to cull through everything that is current or being worked on, and look for those high opportunities to integrate the active transportation improvements with green infrastructure for the multiple benefits there. And then we went through a two-stage prioritization process. And the first part was essentially a technical feasibility analysis. So looking at how well the different locations of project opportunities would allow for green infrastructure. And so that's sort of the hydrology portion of that. And then the second piece was looking at community benefits. And so we have several different co-benefit criteria that were included in the prioritization analysis. And then went through a process of identifying recommended projects and kind of honing them in, and developing funding linkages for the different typologies and different projects, and assigning project phasing for each of those. And then the last part was to develop, I think we have 11 concept plans to help advance the projects from sort of the idea to implementation, and really nice visual images and graphics of the renderings for what these streets could look like in the future. And they do have planning level cost estimates, so hopefully that will help with going after grants and that sort of thing. Okay, so just to go through some of the outputs of the prioritization process. This map is obviously hard to see all the lines and dots there, but this is showing all of the project opportunities that were identified in existing planning documents around the county based on what we looked at. And you're seeing the three main typologies there. The fourth one of frontage improvements is not included because we can't really, we don't have planning documents that identify those opportunities, but we're showing these three typologies. And then we did break the project opportunities into two tiers. And so the top tier opportunities were those that would involve construction and would make much more sense in terms of integrating green infrastructure in a curb area versus maybe a painted bike lane or signage or signals. That sort of improvement would make less sense for integrating green infrastructure. And then we did go ahead and look for new project opportunities too. So we had a whole lot of planned transportation improvements to work with, but we thought, let's go ahead and expand the horizon and look at new opportunities that are not currently identified in planning documents. So that's what you're seeing here. And all these are, you'll notice they're dots rather than lines. So they're not street segments. These are all kind of the smaller spot improvements, the Typology 1 sustainable streets projects where you're looking at safe routes to school or safe routes to transit program connections. And then these were also identified based on not just the distance to a school or a transit hub, but also the pavement condition. And so the streets that are failing or have poorer condition pavement would be higher opportunities to build a sustainable street where you have a road that needs rehabilitation, and it would make more sense to do that, and you'd have some cost sharing with adding in the green infrastructure components. And so that's why I'll just note that you don't see dots in all of the communities, or some have much more than others. And the reason for that really is that in some places there are fewer streets with the poor pavement condition. And so that's where you see fewer opportunities identified. Okay, so this gets into the prioritization process itself, and there's a lot going on here too, I recognize, but I can kind of lead us through this. So this is the technical suitability analysis, focusing on how well these projects can capture and treat and manage stormwater. And so the first part is looking at stormwater spatial effectiveness. And so we're talking about groundwater recharge. We're looking at water quality effectiveness, so how well these particular project locations will address areas that have higher concentrations of pollutants that we're concerned with. And the second piece here is basically the soil condition and how well those areas under the road can infiltrate into the groundwater system. I'm also looking at depth to groundwater as a potential issue. And then the third set here is the site space constraints, and that's really consideration of how much available space in the right of way you have for building green infrastructure. So we looked at the available width of the roadway as well as the length, and then utility conflicts. So looking at major utility conflicts, I think it was sewer and gas lines that we're looking at. So you wrap that up and then prioritize all of the street segments in San Mateo County based on those criteria. And then you have this final output here, and this the darker green and bluish areas are the higher ranking opportunities for green infrastructure in these projects. And then this is just a subset of the co-benefit criteria. And so we had actually 5 in total. The others were urban tree canopy cover, and also looking at pavement condition scores for all of the projects, not just the newly identified opportunities. So we took all of the opportunities, ran them through the technical feasibility analysis, and then secondly through the co-benefit criteria. And I'll just mention each of these briefly. So the vulnerable communities indices was actually a composite of several indices looking at disadvantaged communities. And you may be able to read the fine print here in terms of what those sources are. But the way that we worked this into the analysis was that if a street or a spot improvement lands in one or more of those indices, then you would start to increase the ranking on that project opportunity. And so if you end up in several of these indices, then you would get a much higher ranking. And this index was also weighted twice as heavily as all the others. So we tried to pay more attention to this, especially with concerns about areas where you may have higher impacts on roadways, and thinking about how people may have less access to vehicles and maybe a greater risk to health concerns under climate change. And so that was really the emphasis there. And then second map is looking at places where you have low vehicle ownership. And so in places where you have 10% or more of households do not own a vehicle, we're considering those at a higher risk to the impacts of climate change, especially with precipitation-based impacts and needing to depend more on walking or bicycling or taking transit. So that's the second one there. And then the last is the Urban Heat Island Index, which many of you may be familiar with. This is a Cal EPA index that basically combines the effects of solar radiation on the landscape, depending on the imperviousness of the land, and then also just the kind of local climate conditions. And so you have areas where you have a lot of concrete and paving tend to get really hot with sun and with less fog. So you're seeing that more so on the bay side. And so the reddish or yellow and orange areas are the hotter areas. And these places would be probably would benefit from green infrastructure and things, especially like large trees, street trees and things like that can provide shading. Okay, and so this is the final output. This is basically the what the analysis gave us at the very end of it all. And on the left, you're seeing the prioritized planned project opportunities, again, linked with the transportation investments. And the darker areas, green and blue, are the higher ranking. You see a lot of those along the El Camino corridor, which makes good sense. And then also on the right here, we have the new prioritized opportunities. And those are those additional places where intersections or mid-block crossings where it would make sense to link up with schools and transit hubs. And so these are the sort of final outputs. And then with this process, we asked the municipalities to further vet each of these projects, and we gave them the project list sort of by jurisdiction and asked for feedback on what projects made sense moving forward, and also to assign implementation timelines, either whether they're near term, 0 to 5 years, 5 to 10 years sort of midterm, and then 10 to 20 years as longer term projects. And so that will help with the prioritization of implementation and looking at how to advance these projects. And then the last part was to request input on project concepts. And we asked the municipalities to weigh in on which of the proposed opportunities looked best to them and had good near-term milestones for implementation. And so we ended up with this list, and you can see they're pretty well spread across the county. We also made an effort to bring in different typologies for the different for the various sustainable streets types, and try to get the most out of this design process. So I don't think I have too much more to say here, other than we did also do some initial vetting of the site constraints and making sure that there was space for the proposed improvements and no major utility conflicts and that sort of thing before we moved forward with developing the design so that they hopefully can be used in the future. So I'm just going to run through some of these to show you what they look like. So these concepts are multi-paged. I think they're 5 pages in length, and there's quite a lot in them. And I'll just show a couple of examples and really focus on the renderings, which I think are quite compelling. But here's the first one at El Camino Real in Colma. And so here you're seeing sort of the layout, description of the improvements, describing the site characteristics, green infrastructure performance in terms of the area that's managed for stormwater runoff, and the runoff captured in acre feet and that sort of thing. And then also the active transportation performance benefits. And so we're using things like the change in bicycle level of traffic stress as a metric to gauge the effectiveness or the benefit of these improvements. And just as an example, I won't go into the details here. There's a lot to look at, and it's pretty technical, but this is, looking at a plan view of the transformed streetscape, and you're seeing a bike lane buffered by some green infrastructure and bulb outs and that sort of thing, and a nice cross sections of how the improvements will look and work. And this is really where things start to impress, I think. So here's that stretch of roadway before, and then you're seeing the transformation with this nice perspective. And just to note that the green infrastructure really can provide 2 benefits here in terms of protecting cyclists and pedestrians from the roadway, but then also treating runoff coming off of the road itself. And then you can have shade trees and an additional buffer bioretention area here to treat runoff coming off the sidewalk or adjacent properties. And so this is kind of the full-fledged connectivity improvement here. This is Rollins Road in Burlingame, and this is also a connectivity type project. And here the proposal is for a road diet, where you're actually reducing the lanes and providing either a permeable pavement area or just a colored turn lane here instead of the typical drive lane. And then we're also seeing an improved bike lane and green infrastructure and tree wells. And so here you can see where the runoff would be treated by this tree well here. It's got a nice, fully grown tree in it, capture and treat stormwater, provide that cooling effect. And then here, this is an example of a pervious paving area in the parking lane. So you can still maintain some parking on the street with the tree wells providing some stormwater treatment and breaking up the parking area so that there's a little bit more awareness of bicyclists and pedestrians. This is an example on Grand Avenue in South San Francisco, and this is more of a Typology 3 design where you see the whole downtown area being transformed. Here there was an effort to reduce the roadway width by going from angled parking to a more a parallel parking design and increasing the pedestrian space as a result. And so here you're seeing that change with an added bike lane. And again, we're seeing tree wells in this example, which is a great addition to green infrastructure if you have the space for it. Trees do need a lot of room underground for rooting and proper health. So that's one consideration, but here we're showing an example of that. And then under the boardwalk would actually, you would maintain the bioretention area and soils below that, and perhaps providing more root space for this tree. And so that's part of the concept here, and just a whole lot of a lot more pedestrian space and comfort for bicyclists and pedestrians. And then the last example here is Santa Cruz Avenue in Menlo Park. And this is also a Typology 3 streetscape redesign, where you're seeing like a revitalization of the downtown corridor. And again, going from the angled parking to parallel to reduce that roadway space and do more with it in terms of pedestrian and stormwater improvements. And so here you can see what that could look like. And I like this example because it also shows some of the slow streets concepts that are becoming more popular now, and linking a small parklet here, maybe with tree wells for stormwater treatment. And then here you have just expanded sidewalk area and another boardwalk with trees integrated. So the rainwater could actually flow through that boardwalk and get treated subgrade below that the walkway. Just a really nice example. So I think that concludes my section here. I'm going to turn it back to Matt.
I'm going to just blow through a few of the other things that we did that are some of the tools that we created for our member agencies. One thing that we did a significant effort on that is getting into the technical weeds, but it was a valuable addition to municipal planning, is that we took advantage of some of the high resolution data that's out there from flying flights, where you get this high resolution LiDAR data that allows you to do high resolution drainage delineation. So we significantly improved the drainage mapping that we have throughout the entire county. And so this gets down to sort of the catch basin scale, where you can start to see, one side of the road drains to this location, whereas the other side of the road drains somewhere else. And that's important from the perspective of planning these types of projects, especially if you're planning one of these long linear corridor projects. It's important to know potentially which side streets are draining onto your linear corridor projects, so you know how much amount of area you need to deal with in terms of managing runoff and where you put your green infrastructure facilities. We created a stormwater curb extension tool that allows municipal folks to do a rapid assessment of the ability and feasibility of doing stormwater curb extensions at intersections. So this is a simple Excel tool that they can use to go out and analyze some of the key constraints around doing these types of projects on an intersection to see if it makes sense or not. We have now a pretty extensive library of typical design details that municipalities can use for sustainable streets, and shows sort of the integration between the stormwater and the bike and pedestrian facilities. And so this is helping jurisdictions to be able to start making this stuff more common, and less need to hire consultants to design these projects, which is helping to ultimately drive down the cost of implementation. And then, as I've mentioned, we did do a fair amount of work on policy, model policy language, and this is really, for elected officials to consider and city management to look at. And so we've got a model sustainable streets resolution and policy that would be allowing jurisdictions to go beyond their typical complete streets resolutions and policies to incorporating the green infrastructure and sustainability pieces. We've got model language that can be used for different municipal plans. If you're doing a general plan update, we've got model language that jurisdictions can incorporate regarding sustainable streets. We've got model conditions of approval for development projects. So as jurisdictions start to require development projects to retrofit the adjacent frontages with sustainable streets treatments, as is happening in some jurisdictions already in San Mateo County. We've got model conditions of approval that they can look at for making those requirements. And then we did create a pretty significant GIS-based, web-based tracking tool to track green infrastructure implementation. And this is not only going to track sustainable streets implementation, but it's going to track all types of green infrastructure over time. And so we've got a significant amount of green infrastructure that's been installed on parcels as part of new and redevelopment. Most significant new and redevelopment projects have been required to implement green infrastructure and stormwater management since 2005 in San Mateo County. So we've got 15 years worth of implementation now. And so this tracking tool is going to allow CCAG and all of our member agencies to track progress over time, both in terms of meeting our water quality obligations, but also gives us the ability to track progress towards resiliency goals over time in terms of how much volume are we managing. And so there is a public facing portion of this tool. There's sort of a back end that lets the municipalities get in and mess around with the data and upload projects and things like that. But there is a public facing portion of it that you can go and see the draft version of it right now. And you can access some of the dashboards and see how projects are performing and how we're doing overall in terms of progress towards these targets. CCAG did a separate effort to develop a green infrastructure design guide to support all of our member agencies with developing their green infrastructure plans that are required by some of these water quality mandates. And I just wanted to highlight that we've got sections in there that go to it gets into the how of green infrastructure and how to do it with these different types of stormwater measures, whether it's rain gardens or stormwater curb extensions or trees. Talks about how to do that. And then we've got sort of design strategies and guidelines, and we've got multiple sections that are specific to sustainable streets. So this is also giving municipalities sort of the how to do this, and then the Sustainable Streets Master Plan is more of the which projects should we do this on. This just gives some examples of some of the imagery and whatnot from that GI design guide. So that's also available through the Flows to Bay website. So this is wrapping up where you can find everything. So we did create a virtual website or engagement hub prior to the pandemic situation. We had planned on doing this open house in person, and so we had to switch over and go virtual. So we did create a specific website for that. And then we have all the master plan documents and appendices and a link to the tracking tool on our Flows to Bay website. And then we also have the green infrastructure design guide. So I'm going to turn it back to Reed real quick. He's going to give you a very quick tour of those online resources before I come back and show you the overall schedule, and then we open it up for question and discussion.
Thanks, Matt. Okay, so just to run through these resources very quickly, show you where they are. This is our flowstobay.org website, and there's a short link. It's not showing in my URL here, but there's a short link to /SSMP, so easy to find. And this is where you can get access to details on the master plan. You can download the draft plan itself and review it and provide comments to us. And I'll show you examples of how to do that. There is also a link to a community engagement hub, which I'll show you next quickly. And this is where you can get a concise view of the master plan and the elements that basically we just ran through during this presentation. And there's a specific place to provide feedback on the plan there. And then here you're seeing examples of the renderings, which are pretty cool. And you can slide across to see the transformation. There's a link to the community engagement hub. You can also send me comments or feedback directly. My email address is linked here. There's a flipbook version of the master plan, so it hopefully provides a little bit easier way to view the plan. And then there are extensive appendices. So the plan itself is under 100 pages, but there are hundreds of pages of appendices and a lot of technical details. So if you're inclined that way, please feel free to have at it here. We have the climate change analysis, the prioritization methodology, all the outputs. Someone asked about the project maps and opportunities. Those are all included here separately, so you can download these and review them at your leisure. The project concept plans, the policy documents, everything that we've just discussed is here. So please feel free to have a look. And then there's also a link to the project tracking and mapping tool, which Matt just mentioned, and I'll show you that very briefly. So you can get access to that here as well. And then I'll just show you at the bottom of this page, there's more information on sustainable streets. And then here's a separate viewer of local projects. And these are all kinds of green infrastructure projects that have been built over the past several years. And you can see there are quite a few now in San Mateo County. So that's another way to take a look at what's already been built. Okay, so I'll just show you quickly the engagement hub. This is where we're channeling people to quickly digest the information in the master plan. It has information on basically all of those core components that we just shared with you. Sustainable streets background, climate change, kind of see what these look like. So it's meant to be easy to look at and review. And then this is also where you will go to provide comments if you'd like to submit something more formally. And so I'll show you that here. If you click the "What do you think" link, that will take you to a comment box. And this is where you can type your comments and submit them. And we will get those on our end for consideration.
Hey, Reed, can you make sure you quickly show the prioritized project map?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's another good way to view the project opportunities up close. And so here's a dynamic map of all the opportunity outputs, and you can see them for the planned and new opportunities with different typology here. So you're seeing the lines as street segments and then points as sort of spot improvements. And then if you zoom in and click on a project, then you can get some additional information on where it is, the intersection location, what plan it was referenced from. So that's helpful, I think, whether it's a tier 1 or 2 project, description of what's being proposed, and the outputs for the prioritization results here as well. So hopefully that's useful to everyone and a little bit easier on the eyes. Okay, so I think I showed you the bulk of what is here. And then the last piece is the tracking tool. And as Matt mentioned, this is a beta phase for the project mapping and tracking tool. And so the data will be improved over time, but we do want to invite everyone to visit and have a look, poke around. Again, you can click on things to see more. And so these little tabs are individual projects or even facility improvements, and the outlines, the polygons are parcel locations for where you've seen a green infrastructure project. And so this goes beyond just the sustainable streets projects, and it includes green infrastructure for new development projects as required by the Regional Water Quality Control Board. And so you're seeing low impact development improvements, as well as the sustainable streets projects and other types of green infrastructure. Even regional scale green infrastructure projects will be brought into this over time. But you can click on the legend to show things, modify the view. And then you can also go into, let's see here. You can filter projects based on type, and looking at other metrics for filtering in terms of the acreage or the volume captured. And then I'll just show you an example of clicking on a project where it'll pull up some additional information on that. So here it has measure details. That's the stormwater measure is what it's being referred to. And then some outputs for how that measure is doing under different scenarios. And so this is the annual average stormwater captured by that project, 0.1 acre feet, and some information on how water is being managed by the facility, whether it's retained and moved through the system. Treated would be going through an under drain system. And then you also have bypassed where the storm volume would actually fill to capacity. And then under climate change, you can actually see the different scenarios that we modeled in the master plan and those different return frequencies for different storm sizes. And so you see the peak flow mitigation for this particular project under those scenarios. And currently we're looking at the existing weather conditions or climate conditions. And then you can also view changes, projected changes based on some of the different model outputs that we looked at. So you can view the warm dry projection or cool wet projection, or maybe the median versus the average under the climate change scenario looking out to 2100. So I think that's it as far as the tour, but hopefully these are useful tools. And again, the Flows Bay website is really the go-to for getting access to all of this.
Thanks, Reed. This is our last slide, and then we'll start trying to answer questions. Just want to give folks an idea of the schedule and finishing this plan. So here we are tonight with the open house. We'll be presenting this as the draft plan to our CCAG Board of Directors, which is one elected official from every one of the 21 municipalities on Thursday night. We're asking for feedback from the public and stakeholders through January 6th. And as Reed said, you can either put comments into that box on the engagement hub or email directly to Reed at his email address there. And then we'll take those comments and make revisions as needed, and hopefully turn around a final draft of the master plan by the beginning of February. And then we're planning on bringing it to the CCAG board for consideration of adoption as a final plan at their meeting on February 11th. And so that is all that we wanted to show you tonight.